Good evening, everybody, and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Levit. I'm the director of the Master of Architecture program here at the John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design. And it's my pleasure to, this evening, introduce you to tonight's featured speaker, who will be presenting our last bulthaup lecture of the academic year. The first lecture on a warm evening. I think, although I regret it because it means the end of skiing, but anyway. I would like to take a moment first to thank the sponsor of tonight's event, bulthaup. Bulthaup sponsorship has made it possible for us to bring you a wide range of exceptional speakers from around the world. This year we welcomed Ole Schroeder from Copenhagen, Peter Rose from Boston, Sam Jacobs from London, and tonight Jimenez Lai, who joins us from Los Angeles. Bulthaup has partnered with the Daniels faculty over the past 9 years, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Stefan Sibidlo, principal of Bulthaup, who joins us here this evening. Thank you, Stefan, for your continued sponsorship of the Bulthaup lectures. Thank you. Now, on to our featured speaker. We are thrilled to welcome Jimenez Lai to the Daniels faculty to present this public lecture. Jimenez is an alumnus of our faculty. I remember him myself from my first few years here and his fabulous thesis. And he graduated from the Master of Architecture program in 2007. Since then, he has gone on to a successful career as the founder and principal of the firm Bureau Spectacular. On the firm's website, Jimenez writes that Bureau Spectacular, quote, imagines other worlds and engages the design of architecture through telling stories. Jimenez's own story after graduating from the Daniels faculty includes winning the Architectural League Prize for Young Architects in 2012 and the Début Award at the Lisbon Triennale in 2013, which is presented to an architect under 35 in recognition of an outstanding career. In 2014, Jimenez was selected to represent Taiwan and the Venice Biennale. I'd like to add that I think that his work takes up themes that have often been treated with a great undiluted gravitas in the historical avant-gardes and lends them a wit through the context of narratives and the transformation of some of the historical ideas into newly fashioned works. It's not that his positions have lost any of the seriousness which motivated the earlier avant-gardes, but rather through, I think, the wit and humor of his contemporary work, they more openly reveal the, how I would put it, the sort of desirous or libidinal nature of play, which was at the heart of the historical avant-gardes and their formal experiments. Thus, for instance, in the phalanstery module, a gyroscope-like space that dissolves traditional distinctions between different orthographic projections, he places that within a narrative of an interplanetary Noah's Ark, which is traveling in search of a new home planet. And in this gravity-free field, traditional notions of plan, section, and elevation are dissolved, but in this context of weightlessness, which is in a sense a kind of fantasy of freedom from gravitational pull. I'd also like to add that his focus on furniture, the size of small architecture or a kind of furniture-sized architecture, places the space of the individual at the center of his undertakings. It seems to me that it reflects, to my mind, a contemporary commitment in architecture which ruminates on the growing role and importance of attention to the experiences of the individual. And this is well reflected in the scale and nature of his architecture, but also, I think, in the narratives within which they're contextualized. These fantastical narratives, I think, lend a personal touch and interpolate the individual into the architecture in a very particular way. On top of his practice, Jimenez has taught at the University of Illinois and is currently a faculty member at UCLA. His piece, White Elephant, is part of the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, while Toronto's Workshop Gallery has his work, Little Monster, on permanent display. Last summer, work by Jimenez's firm was featured in the Toronto exhibition, Flipping Properties, which took place in a laneway in Little Portugal and was a continuation of Jimenez's study of super furnitures, structures too big to be furniture and too small to be architecture. His first manifesto, Citizens of No Place, was published by Princeton Architectural Press with a grant from the Graham Foundation. Jimenez's lecture this evening, titled Clouds, Rainbows, and You, will look at everything from comic books, furniture, and super furniture to small buildings and large building proposals. Please join me in welcoming him to the podium tonight.
Thanks, Robert. And I'm really, really happy to be back here. Truly an honor. Normally, after years of doing this, I'm not so nervous, but tonight I'm nervous as heck because I'm in this room again. Okay, so Robert also gave away everything I was going to talk about. So yes, I am indeed from here. I went to school here. Currently, I live in Los Angeles, and I'll, first and foremost, give you a little breakdown of what you're about to consume, so that you're not bored by the time you're a few minutes into it. This talk is largely broken up into 5.5 parts, with an introduction. Prior to this, with an introduction, there's also a little plug of a current exhibition that we're doing right now. So the current exhibition that we're doing right now is at the Graham Foundation. I've taken the task of organizing a show of not just myself, but of 14 colleagues, 14 contemporaries of mine whom I deeply admire. And so the name of the show is called Treatise, Why Write Alone? We were also very fortunate to have been able to work with excellent graphic designers. Here you're looking at the work of Natasha Jen, one of the partners of Pentagram. She generously gave us her time to work on the graphic design of this lovely piece. But at the Graham Foundation, they also employed Zach Kais to produce this nod to anemic cinema from Marcel Duchamp for us. The premise of this exhibition is in 3 parts. I wrote a grant to the Graham Foundation titled Gangs, Summits, and Manifestos. Gangs, thinking about the tradition of people forming clusters of like-minded thinking, perhaps the Chicago 7 or the New York 5, and so on and so forth. We can go, summits, and thinking about Charlottesville tape in the early 1980s and how the effects of putting a bunch of people in a room and the type of frictions that, productive frictions that may ensue. And manifestos, thinking about pamphlet architecture, or the tradition of pamphlet architecture in the late 70s, early 80s, when Stephen Hall and Bill Stout began this endeavor. We decided that we're going to also, in addition to this exhibition, we'll also publish 14 books. And this book series comes out in one Netflix dump on March 28th. So if you look at the work of these people, such as Soft Lab, or Norman Kelly, or Design with Company, there's very little in common between people. Also, I'll get to that maybe in a little. This is Bitter Tang, Young Ayada, from Michael Young and Gutan Ayada, Andrew Kovacs, Speedism, the Belgian architect, and Alex Mymond. Amongst a few others, but I invite you to look on the website. There are probably photographs that we can find, and I also invite you to order some of these books if you want. But I've indeed published a book 2-3 years ago now with Princeton Architectural Press titled Citizens of No Place. No Place, thinking about the etymology of utopia. But in the world, there are maybe 70 or 80 of these books, which was the graphic design that I proposed to PAP, which they rejected. They went for this one, but I made an online call for people to send in their books, and I spray painted over them and sent it back to people. So there's roughly 70 of these books out there in the world. But the content of this book, if you flip through it, you'll realize that this is basically a comic book. And now you might ask yourself, why would a architect make a comic book? What is the relationship here? And to me, it was a natural transition because, let's say the communication of architectural line work is a type of, language between architects. The control of line weight, density, framing. These are techniques of describing scale and texture and pace and rhythm. So I felt that this was a natural way to communicate linguistically. But I also think there's a longer history to the idea of communication graphically and also through text and images. The longer history, I'm not a betting man, but I'm willing to bet that none of these guys sat for a pose. No? Okay. Meaning, these kinds of compositions came from inaccurate reports or inaccurate recounts, a kind of ancient journalism through caricature making, and through its byproduct of errors. Abstraction becomes inevitable, and I find that to be productive in the path towards making symbols, abstract symbols. Abstract symbols that may be drawn in elevation, but occupy the plane as though it is a plan. I find these things very interesting. But fast forward to the tradition of caricature making and journalism, we know that political caricature relies on familiar readability of parts, such as, the nose of certain people, or the birthmarks, or the glasses, or the hair. If they are recognizable, we speak them with hyperbole. And that to me is the power of cartoon, and that also to me is a kind of design approach towards the re-representation of context and reality. And I would say, the production of repeated caricatures until they become icons, or until they become typology, is a part of what architecture makes, a kind of archetype or set of archetypes. These are photographs from Becker and Becker. In some ways, I would say the relationship between making Gorbachev or Reagan instantly readable and produce associations of the look of these people has everything to do with these kinds of facades. All right, so that was the introduction. Now I'm going to get into the first part of the 5 parts. The first, and you also have to tell you that these divisions are pretty meaningless. First, I want to talk about gravity. As Robert mentioned, my first built work was this project. This was built in Los Angeles back in 2008. The name of this project is Fallon Street Module. It's a room that rotates at once an hour. In other words, it behaves like a clock. Every 15 minutes, one of the planes would become parallel with the ground. And every 7.5 minutes, a kind of social collision between people would happen because the planes are now oblique to its relationship with the ground. Why would this be important? And I guess at the time I was really interested in spaceships. Due to the fellowship of the Howard Wright graduate fellowship that I took here, I spent roughly 8 months to a year at Taliesin. At the time, like any fresh-minded, good-hearted young individual, I thought the suburbs are evil and urbanism is great. And who do we blame for suburbs? Naturally, Frank Lloyd Wright and Broadacre City. And I also freshly came out of an exhibition of Ante's, and I saw that he set a shopping mall free into space, and decided that it's a good time to follow suit and take the ever-expanding Broadacre City and inscribe it into an envelope into space and let it go. Like any young left-leaning person, I was very attracted to the writing of Charles Fourier, and so Fallon Street became, a framework of thinking about the urban design of this interior, thinking that we can put a city inside of a building, and I began expanding upon it and thinking about the day-to-day details of this world, what type of political authority would have to be there, what type of surface conditions would have to exist, and what type of interactions between individuals would there have to be. After I finished and entered a career of teaching, I continued these stories inside the spaceship. In one of these instances, for example, in the gravity training room, people would be evaluating the functions of elevation versus plan, or functions of sections versus plan, where it's due to its outline and relationship with the ground, a suggestive readability of its symbol becomes one of the functions of its elevation. Whereas the functions of the plan is about politics and territory making, or let's say, the bleeding in between of overlapping territories and the strategic organization of the territories. You can even zoom in and look at what type of coastlines produces what type of spatial effects. So, a case of flat generators. Plan as generator. An interesting plan could easily result in an uninteresting figure. An interesting section, on the other hand, while creating an interesting mass, produces a hollow interior. So that was an obsession at the time, thinking about let's rotate the four-sided shape, which is a rectangle, square, inscribe that inside of a circle and let it rotate. But fortunately, last summer with Suying and Jen, we were able to produce this installation called Flipping Properties. We added one more surface to engage a different quality about rotation, which is the familiar reading of visual language. This particular pentagon, which has two perpendicular angles in its relationship with the ground, has become synonymous with house. It's almost become a hieroglyph of what a house is. And so if I drew that in Microsoft Word, house. But our thinking at the time was, let's slice it at 45-degree angles into 5 parts and allow it to rotate, and allow the 5 surfaces to take a stand with the ground and see whether or not a distortion of the readable visual language can be maintained or destroyed. We were also very fortunate that the Biltmore Furniture Company allowed us the time and space to construct this piece. So as it rotated, one of the things that came from the Foundry module was how the human body fit onto the curvatures, and the dimensions, the calibrations of the dimensions of the curvature would be conducive to social behaviors. So that's part 1, gravity, and in which we covered rotation and orthographic drawings. Part 2 is called pareidolia, but before I get into the actual definition of pareidolia, I have to continue a little further on gravity. In 2009, we were approached by a gallery in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky, to design another installation thinking about rotation. Coming freshly off of the Fallon Stream module high, we were thinking, yeah, let's do another project that rotates, but except this time, let's shift our focus into the exterior mass of this project instead of an inward-looking interiority world of orthographic projections. Meaning, due to our insistence on studying the effects of plan becoming section, we had to, lock the 4 drawings along an axis and allow it to rotate. Once this revolution completes, it has to be a cylinder. It has to be a cylinder. But if that's not our focus anymore and our interest is now about mass, we can deal with spheres, and we wanted to deal with spheres the second time around with our installation. And I'll jump directly into the result. The name of this project is it's called the White Elephant. There is a bounding sphere around the white elephant. It behaves like a tripod, or a set of tripods, or a jack. If you look at its primitive geometry, it's 2 sets of tetrahedrons against one another, mirror against one another. There are three basic principles to this project as we were designing it. Number one, we wanted to do a project that is hard on the outside, soft on the inside. Over my years of being in the world, I've come to realize that I like everything that's hard on the outside, soft on the inside, including food and people. And architecture. So we were looking at the geometry, hard geometry and soft geometries. We were noticing that, around the schools of the United States, there are people who had expert knowledge of how to handle hard geometry versus soft geometry. We were thinking, let's figure that out, and also the tactility of something that's actually dent versus something that's really livable. So that's thought number one, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. Thought number two is that we wanted to make something that can be rotated, that can be tumbled. And you might ask, why must it tumble? And this is our answer. This is why it must tumble. And the easy answer is its relationship with the ground produces a different proportion and a different persona per our reading. I'll use this story to maybe illustrate that thought a little bit. So here you see a man stalking a deer. He thinks through the strategies of the deer. He jumps and hugs the deer and slices the throat open. But he does not take the flesh. He takes only the skin very systematically and enthusiastically. He takes the skin, he sews it back together, and he covers himself under this cloak, or under this carpet, the first architectural detail, the cladding. He takes this first architectural detail, the cladding, and runs over to the woman that he loves and tells her, well, kill the deer, skinned it, and so no reaction. But he covers himself under this cloak and dances. He dances, and by covering himself under the cloak, he abstracts the details of his intentions and emotions and creates a barrier of mystery between and a set of tension. And the abstraction of his posture, of his dance, becomes a skyline. And you might ask, does posture have anything to do with architecture? And here I would like to present a case of why I think so. The study of posture through the history of art, which we've become very familiar with in ancient Greece and the great Greek Kouros of 600 BC, we see a bilaterally stiff individual standing there, smiling ambiguously. Now, jumping forward to the 15th century in Michelangelo's David, we see a youth performing contrappostal, an S figure exuding a relaxed pose. And Bernini's David, a torque around the spine, performing a sense of intensity. So even if we cannot read the detail of their faces, we can understand the body language of stiff, relaxed, and tense. And does this have anything to do with architecture? I would say the translation of the human body into the column and is precisely named that way, the capital, the shaft, and the base. And in the late 1920s, during the Chicago Tribune competition, Adolf Loos took this a step further by rereading Louis Sullivan's tripartite stack of the Chicago skyscraper division of how we build higher, and submitted this pretty, let's say, literal interpretation of the Doric column as a skyscraper, which I think is fabulous. So if I were to say, I find the mass of the Seattle Public Library to be very pleasing, could it be possible that the Seattle Public Library is a tripartite stack performing contrappostal? Is this why this particular mass communicates such a sense of relaxation? And does this matter at all at a larger context when we look at the abstractions of how we communicate a society into a simple skyline, mugs and T-shirts? The individual characters of the pieces of the architecture that compose the city as a sentence has that power? I would say yes, architecture does that. The individual pieces of architecture does that. It does compose a greater whole, and it is performing the task of alphabet. To drive this point home, these are cities, and one does not even have to say anything special, but how you say it makes a voice of that. So, often in spousal disputes, one could say stuff like, "Oh, it's not what you're saying, but how you're saying it." That's absolutely true. This voice versus that voice are sounding completely differently, much the same way that we compose the cities as sentences. So if I'm interested in, let's say, mass and character, why wouldn't I just directly talk about the Venturi duck? I would say this is the reason why, because of mystery, because of prolonged tension in the storytelling or the story writing of a novel. I do not necessarily want a novel to be told to me the straightaway answer of its ending. In fact, I kind of like it when there is no ending, where there is a plateau of how the story ends when thinking about storylines, story arcs such as Waiting for Godot. So these are sketches of John Haydek, highly suggestive of crowns or tentacles or so, but never exactly spoken. There's a non-exact figuration that's happening in these clouds. So the non-exact figuration in these clouds, gets me back to the point of pareidolia that I opened this chapter with. The idea of pareidolia is a, let's say, gift or a skill that all Homo sapiens possess. I don't even have to necessarily tell you what you're looking at. You may be able to find it, but they're not there. The Mars face may be the greatest poster child of pareidolia. How have we become such amazing apex predators of this planet? Is it because we're simply smarter? I would say, in addition to that, we know how to cooperate. We're able to tell within split seconds whether or not we're staring at a friend or a foe, because we're expert readers of faces and body languages. So such expert readers of body languages that we have to fend ourselves off of foes or make bonds between friends, that we instantly project gender and attitude towards a pile of rocks. Gender and attitude and even personality onto things that have no personality. Shocking, really, how easy this task can be performed with such few elements. And for those of us who's ever taken art classes to draw faces, we probably know that this is the first step. You have to draw half division points and then identify the half of the half. But then this is my relationship with the 4 square and the 9 square. I believe that this is a kind of nuanced dialing of intentions and poses, because this is, I believe, a design problem. Let me just keep driving this point a little further. The many moods of Emma Watson versus the many moods of Kristen Stewart. So what we do know about this situation right now is that the eyes and the nose and so forth are grown exactly onto Emma Watson's face. It's impossible to remove them, but then through the nuanced twitching of the muscles, she's able to express a wide variety of emotions. What this tells us is that we, in this room, Homo sapiens, are expert readers of proportions. We're expert readers of form and proportion, and we're able to consume this type of expression with detailed analysis within a very short amount of time. These are facades of John Haydek, and maybe the stories are there and maybe they're not, but the elements are laid down in place, and I read them, and perhaps somebody else wouldn't, but that's, to me, the beauty of pareidolia, a mystery novel. All right, moving on, super furniture. So far we've covered thoughts on gravity and pareidolia, we're clouds watching, but I want to next talk about super furniture. So roughly 10 years ago, I went and worked for a Dutch artist, Joep van Lieshout. Joep is a very strange individual. In fact, he lectured here in this room, and I was really taken by that talk, thanks to Shane Williamson's invitation. And I went and emailed him about his active independence declaration. So this is the first thing I worked on, the rectum bar, when I arrived in Rotterdam. It's anatomically as correct as possible. He really wanted us to focus on these things as well. It's super gross. And on inside, there are these tubes of brown pleather that we had to fill with foam. Kids loved them. He owned this plot of land on the piers of Rotterdam. Day in and day out, we often looked at cargoes coming in, kind of amazing. And he owned this piece of land, and he constructed what he calls AVL-ville. He declared independence to the Dutch government, making his own flag. And I mean, in some countries, that's considered treason, right? But the Dutch government ignored him, and he continued to behave in his own way, and made this kind of international call for artists to unite and join this commune. And as I mentioned earlier, with my susceptible sensibilities to left-leaning qualities, I joined this commune and arrived as an illegal worker. I couldn't get proper housing, and there was no problem because it's totally okay to, so he owned a bunch of these shipping containers, so I lived there in the shipping container. Pretty great. I also had 0 possessions. This, in Celsius, this is also 5 degrees higher or lower to your deficit each time. So there was a heat wave at 35 degrees Celsius, and I was in there. But when I finally had a job in Chicago, I lived there for 6-7 years. I worked at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, with director Bob Sommel. I happened upon this room in a former warehouse. This is 1,400 square feet for roughly $1,000. That's insane, right? Anyway, I thought that was insane, so I signed up. And I decided to take a piece of that memory and bring it back and as a personal box. And I call this project the briefcase house, where I put all of my personal belongings inside of the box. And outside of it, I established what became a Bureau Spectacular. The idea of let's say a condensed box that contains most of the vital functions really isn't novel. If we look at the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe in Plano, Illinois, this is an interior shot of the Farnsworth House. You realize that this box has the fireplace on the other side. There's the kitchen, bathroom, storage, all that's there. There's no wall erected all the way around, yet the mere presence of this obstruction created 4 programs. It created 4 separate spaces. I found that to be really interesting, and I wanted to take off that. It was also during a very turbulent time in my life where I only cared about what I wanted to do. So I had strategies in my head and geometries in my heart, and wanted to condense everything in my life into a private black nollie planned box. And so when I'm outside of it, it is as obstructive and solid as black. But when I'm inside of it, the rest of the world is as solid and black as anything else, where I can draw a detailed wall section that can be programmed. And that's the interior. There's my cat. She's still alive. Her name is Helvetica. I decided to put in a shot of her. Sometimes she forgets to retract her tongue after saying stuff to people. Everything can be closed off. And so this was the thought of briefcase house. I also described something to you. Many of you may know what I'm talking about. Amongst my contemporaries, there's a tradition of people who are not credible or old enough to be commissioned for full architecture. And therefore, a lot of us built installations. A lot of these installations are partial architectures, perhaps investigations on the tessellation of doubly curved surfaces. The more daring would even try to do translucent instead of tessellated surfaces, which is very difficult, all very difficult. These types of explorations, I would say, are localized effects of studies of architecture, and I didn't really want to do that. Instead, this came out, and once we finished it, I was thinking, is this an installation? But I live in it, and therefore it's a whole. It's not a part. Is this architecture? It's not architecture. Clearly not a building by any definition. Also, it's too big to be furniture, and that's when that thought began to emerge. Too big to be architecture, too big to be furniture, too small to be architecture. A kind of super furniture that you can reside inside of. As a passport holder and citizen of Taiwan, in 2013, I decided to make a submission to Taipei, to the Ministry of Culture, when there was an open call for the design and curation of the Taiwan Pavilion at the 2014 Venice Biennale. The name of this project is Township of Domestic Parts, and our initial thought was, let's take the house and explode it into 9 programs and construct 9 single program houses of super furniture sort variety and distribute them into an interior, much the same way we would consider an interior urbanism. An interior urbanism of a person who is interested in cartoon, let's say the outline of the plan now is the page. That becomes the outline of the page. And the figure ground where it's, these whited out solids are now the boxes of the episodes in the comic book. And these blackened areas are now the gutters between the frames of the comic book. And if the comic book is a set of episodes in an urbanistic way in a domestic interior, it is something that you can walk around, you can walk through, and that was the train of thought at the time. We decided to develop it inside of this. This was our context, the Palazzo della Prigioni. It's right next to the Bridge of Sighs, next to the Sanseverino Doge's Palace. And we built 9 little houses, 9 little super furnitures, or 9 really big super furnitures, and thought of it as an urbanism, township of domestic parts. Here you're looking at the house of social dining, house of sleep, and so on and so forth. We also decided that the cartoonish sensibility can be translated into a type of graphic. The archi characters can be developed as the individual programs would have characters. These photos were taken by Iwan Ban. Okay, so. Bricks and balloons. I've talked about the super furnitures, and the title of this talk is Clouds, Rainbows, and You. I've talked about our interest in comics and super furniture, and let me talk about comics a little bit. This is a story that I produced called Sociopaths, and to me, the idea of the frames and the composition of the speech bubbles, and even at times architecture as frames or as speech bubbles, became, let's say, a game of composition. Like I said, if the boundary of the page is now how I look at plan or a site, would it be interesting or not very interesting if, language is entirely dissolved? And I will talk about bricks and balloons, or the piling together of bricks and balloons in the following way. So here is an exquisite corpse that we've seen from André Breton and friends in Switzerland, in Zurich in the 1920s or 19-teens, where we know the game, a torso's coming, but you don't know what the head is. You also know you're in charge of the legs, but you don't know, the other parts of the body. Therefore, a kind of awkwardness ensues. a type of, let's say, Frankenstein, where the whole is made up of over-articulated parts. Let's talk about part-to-whole relationship and bricks and balloons. Here is the proposal or the competition entry for the Bruges Concert Hall by Neutling's Reedijk Architects in 1998. And this project was extensively written by Bob Sommel in his essay, Green Dot 101. In this essay, a thought was being developed called the saturated shape, where disparate parts are aggregated into a whole and made especially possible by the gift wrapping of a consistent facade. But time and again, I find myself drawn to things with no consistent facade. Here's the Dutch Pavilion in Hanover by NBRDV. This is the Prada Foundation. But what if we were to say a kind of Frankenstein where exquisite game of exquisite corpse is even being played here in Villa de Lava, where Villa Savoie is stacked onto Johnson Glass House? Or worse yet, can the density itself communicate mass without skin? Here's the work of Andrew Kovacs and talk about the idea of the over-articulation of part-to-part relationship and a deliberate sloppiness in tectonics. Or the work of Spiedism, Peter Jan Hinkels in Brussels, as a, let's say, super DJ that shows us readable parts but then pile them together. And talking about piles, here's New York, Las Vegas. Is this, it's a building. It's one single building taking the cliche of a city and composing 25 or 30 different facades into a single facade. So these are the trains of thoughts that were running, I guess, through my head when I began thinking about the comic book as a collision of piles of bricks and balloons. Even to a point where I'm thinking that the collage city tradition or the compromatio drawn by Piranesi is of that tradition as well. Here we're looking at OMA's Parc de la Villette. So we began to consider the thought of piling readable parts in our own work. This is one of our tower proposals where we wanted to take readable parts and stack them into a thing. Where even earlier on, we're looking at other types of readable clouds and drawing them as a section, drawing them as an architectural section, challenging the notion of the typical plan in a skyscraper. But a project that I think culminates these thoughts pretty well, especially communicates the title of this lecture pretty well, Rainbows, Clouds, and You, is in the 99 Chairs speech buster project that we did for Storefront for Art and Architecture. So last year, or 2 years ago, Storefront for Art and Architecture celebrated its 30th anniversary, and they asked us to design a very large furniture for them to house this event. We decided to take the footprint of Storefront, which is a trapezoid, and explode it into many clouds with a rainbow slash over it. And we thought that the explosion of the clouds would give us program because of its curvatures and dimensions and our body's reactions to, let's say, 18 inches. We're just going to sit down if it's 18 inches, or 50-some inches, we're just going to lean over. Pardon my dimension unit. I've been living in the United States for a few years. But when we broke it apart, when we took Storefront out on the street and exploded it, magical things happened. People really occupied it, and we did not invite them. But earlier in the day, we were saying if you set the stage, people will play their parts. Players will play their parts. I guess or the idea if you build it, they will come. These people really showed up like a magical moment in a movie. We later cladded them with mostly gray material. It was all fabricated by this guy, Reeves Rash, amazing fabricator. If you're looking for someone to fabricate something for you, he's the man. He's based in Kentucky. The rainbow color worked as an index for us to be able to put this three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle back together like a broken Humpty Dumpty. And we were also discovering certain details, such as these lines. the soft material that we were using has certain thicknesses that we couldn't avoid. So when they joined each other at a corner, it was very unsightly. We decided to take the logic of corner bead and tape it over and iron it over, and this worked as a thick line around the edges to cover this detail. And I thought this was a really amazing moment watching Eva, Kyung Park, Sarah Herda, and Joseph Grima, the four directors of Storefront over the last 30 years. And we were missing Shirin, but you know, they were sitting together talking about shovels. It was amazing. So once again, talking about bricks and balloons, you know, here I apologize because I really would have wanted to put Greg Lynn's fountain here as well as a part of this same conversation of bricks and balloons. But instead, I'm using Enzo Mari's, I guess, puzzle piece of animals, and at the risk of quoting Liu Kang, what if, you know, if these bricks wanted to be something, perhaps they had, even to a point where they had characters. I think it's important to be thinking about the contemporary practice of installation work as bricks, such as people like Soft Lab, for example, who are friends of mine. But I think, you know, what they do are really intricate bricks, right? But in this case, these are very different bricks. And so if we were to say the drizzles of Jackson Pollock are made up of consistent bricks, and his relationship with the edge implies that he'll go on forever, meaning if we gave him a canvas of different shape, he would also do that. And as far as preparing the part-to-whole relationship, I would say I want to design the Mickey Mouse as much as the rectangle, as much as the drizzle. Okay, I think I'm running a little long, and I'm going to fly through these, just some images that I'm working with often. This is a really important book for us. No, I'm being totally serious. I was introduced to this book by Michael Speaks on Bullshit, by Harry G. Frankfurt. You know, also coming out of the world of making acronyms, Bureau Spectacular is not an accident. No? Okay. I can tell you the central thesis of this book very briefly in the Cole's notes. In America, they say Cliff Notes. Here we say Cole's notes. So there's a distinction between lying and bullshitting. Lying requires truth. It is a deliberate act of covering truth. Bullshit, on the other hand, does not require truth. And so when you're handed a blank site of a thing that you're supposed to design or make up, there is no incorrect, you know, act of deceiving somebody. You're sort of making it up as you go along. And the better the articulation of how you make it up and what you produce eventually becomes as real as concrete. And so what I got out of that book, you know, along the lines of this central thesis, is that there is a type of cultural construction in the act of drawing or landing pen on blank page. I'm also really tired of talking about these things, so I'm just going to fly through them. But here you see a man sleeping with the building. He's being arrested. There's a future archaeologist studying a contemporary early 21st century man, asking, was architecture this or that? And so in the academy, architecture is this, architecture is that, in the field findings. And so in the Victor Hugo sense of the word, this will kill that, this has no relationship with that. I like the story a lot, so I'll tell the story a little bit. It's a graduation of the 3 kids from kindergarten. So these are 3 kids from kindergarten graduating. They're asking each other, what do you want to be when you grow up? And one kid wants to be a fireman. He wants to jump through buildings and, you know, sleep on Murphy beds and so forth. And this is the house that he wants to have. It's like a clubhouse where you can play superhero toys. Second kid, this second kid, he realizes he wants to be an astronaut, but he knows that he's too fat for it, so he wants to work in the aerospace space control center and help bring people home. And that's the kind of home that he wants to live in. And the third kid wants to be a professional athlete, and he thinks that he's going to be so rich and famous, he'll live in a castle with walls so thick he can fit a village inside of it to serve him. But you know, they also imagine all of their futures together into a single home. So this idea of the, I guess, aggregation or composition of the bricks and balloons has evolved in some ways. The cartoon is no longer, for me, just a representation. It's even becoming a tool of design. We've been using this type of sampling of parts and the freedom of the sampling of parts and identifying other qualities of cartoons, such as, you know, the control of curves. Often these are filleted edges as opposed to splines. You know, and even conventions of projection, such as the choisi. It really influenced the way that we, you know, build models now, even the way that we design and build models. This was our entry to the Guggenheim competition. We didn't win, but upon a closer look, you realize that we are trying to deal with the cartoonish curves as productive ways of thinking about. So it's frozen. Oops. Help. Help. Help me. Is it here?
Yeah, you can do that one.
Like I said, cartoon is no longer just a way of representation. It's even becoming a graphic language and design sensibility for us. The way that we compose sections and plans now have largely to do with it. Okay, so here's the home stretch. Here's the half of the 5.5 parts I was promising you, futures and past. These days I'm drawing a lot of these kinds of murals and almost graffitis on different types of surfaces. I'm producing this new one right now, which is going to be on view at the Art Institute of Chicago in April. But, you know, when thinking about Stanley Tigerman's career collage, which was also commissioned by the Art Institute of Chicago, this was at a point of Stanley's career where they were asking him to put all of the buildings together into an urbanism, whereas I feel like I'm really interested in drawing anything but my own work. You'll see, here's the Das Canoas house from Niemeyer. Is that you know, Manhattan transcript? Could this be the corridor of the wall house? And is that the facade of storefront? You know, is that a megaron from a Greek temple? And so I think the act of, you know, splicing many parts together, or even kind of, let's say, copy or caricature making, has really recently taken over, you know, our minds at Bureau Spectacular, in particular our growing interest in the work of Hieronymus Bosch, our growing interest in the idea that this world is made up of multiple anecdotes that by themselves would be perfect centers of gravity, but together it's a type of mess of an urbanism that is something that I'm completely after. So I'm happy to report that I'm doing well, and this is the a sort of homecoming report card, bringing back to your former professors. And you know, remember this moment, Robert? You were right there. So thank you very much, everyone. We're happy to take some questions. Yeah. Yes, Dom.
Hey, Jim.
Hi.
We were in class together. How does it feel to be back?
You know, it's also weird. I remember that corner, it's really hard to get out. No, good.
I have a question about how your representation evolved, like getting into architecture school, whether it played a part.
Can you speak closer to the mic?
Sure. I was wondering, I guess, how your representation evolved as you were a student and like learning about architecture. Like, did it start from like early years and you identified, I don't know, graphic novels, etc., as like a technique for thinking, or whether you saw that as like a solution to that like came later on.
Okay. How has the work evolved, or how has representation evolved? I think even back at school here, I was always really interested in all kinds of representation. I was, rendering like anybody else, and also at times building model too, and shooting the models with nice backdrop and making nice photographs. But the cartoon stuff, I think there was an immediacy at the beginning and kind of speed that was involved. I could just draw really fast, and I needed to get stuff out of the way, and so this kind of maybe desire for mass production, and also a kind of expediency was behind the thought process at the time. But with more experience and also with, let's say, a wider range of diet, I think I've grown to like a lot of things. And so these days I'm trying to do, photography as well, and, motion moving images.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. You introduced the book on bullshit. I'm just wondering, what's your relationship to the notion of bullshit?
Yes. The acronym of Bureau Spectacular is, BS. First of all, I mean, and I'll say that's a really deliberate choice because, we like things funny. We like humor. We like to be lighthearted, nonchalant. Recently learned a word called sprezzatura. I guess it's a word that Italian historians study. Certain painters' nonchalant behavior, but a deep investment in how to be nonchalant. And so, I think bullshit is, let's say, an active ingredient in the mix of that. It's a kind of sensibility of the work as well, I think. I mean, Robert was generously saying that it is not without seriousness. Most of the work is really serious. We're dealing with geometry and actually, looking at history as closely as we can. And we're, some of our closest friends are PhD people. I really enjoy in fact, conversing with PhD people sometimes more than, normal people. Because it makes me feel really dumb, and I enjoy that sense of discomfort. No, but then I think, bullshit is kind of important also with the attitude of thinking about faking it till you make it. And, this entire career so far has been somewhat of a bubble. We finally got a call for the first time from people who want us to design for them. Most of this stuff was either through grants or personal income. And, we, citizens of no place, nobody commissioned us. I just started drawing. And so I think, the idea of faking a reality into actual existence, if bullshit warrants that, we like that, I think.
Hi. You talk a lot about anecdotes and also the cartoons that are associated with your projects. I was wondering what the thought process you go through for each of those storyboards.
The storyboard, you're talking about not this stuff. Like this stuff? Okay. Well, the process, I mean, I can very earnestly tell you, typically it's considered as wholes. You know, like, I guess there's maybe a slight distinction between the tradition of manga and comics, I think. With manga, I think there's also a speed involved in reading. I think people actually flip, and the act of flipping is part of the consumption of the material. And therefore, the text and its relationship with images are less important. Whereas whenever it is that I read DC or Marvel Universe, it's really text heavy most of the time. And the part-to-whole relationship is heavily considered in parts, not necessarily wholes. You know, and maybe it's through the way that I've become as an architect. I like thinking about wholes more than parts, and therefore the pages are first composed as wholes and then broken down to parts. And so that's one thing that I always pay attention to. The other is, since it's already a comic book, it's real important to me that each page is at least has something to do with architecture. If not a section, if not some diagrams, you know, if not some line work that I want to test out. So these are maybe the two. I'm also increasingly, you know, like kind of not doing this stuff anymore. I'm trying to do more of this stuff.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, like you have such a playful sense of humor and how that tends to be received by more serious, like somber architects.
Yeah. No, it's a really important thing to ask because, you know, it could be a source of frustration. I think I've evoked rage out of people from from such nonchalant attitudes, and it's bad. And also, people don't like irony at all. So yes, there's at times problems of working with somber people, but you know, I think it's something that I just have to work on. I need to maybe stop being such a little child and, you know, be a little more serious. Maybe not.
Maybe this is kind of timely because students here are doing their thesis projects right now. Research comes up a lot in architecture, of course, and I was wondering, how do you define research and how do you research for your projects?
That's a really good question, and it's really, really hard to answer. I mean, on the one hand, you know, like I said, I'm drawn to people who do proper research. And at the same time, I think there's a kind of research that exists in production rather than reading. Recently, I watched a video of someone proclaiming Kanye West to be the greatest philosopher of our time. And the argument was being made that, you know, just because a philosophy professor or a student spends a lot of time in the library, you know, consuming the products of people of the past, they often forget that the production of such philosophy was done by young men and women in the library when they were their age and when they didn't know what they were doing or what they're saying. And so I think it's maybe a two-way street of production and consumption. And I think, you know, and also there's a lot of work. I think I would say this is, although you're seeing a lot of things, I would say maybe 80% of our day-to-day life or production that we thought were complete and finished and beautiful just sucked. It just was bad, and and so it's. I would say maybe research has to do with that too. Mass production, mass consumption, and a lot of failures.
Are there more? We call it a day? Okay. Is that all right?
Yeah.
We make this the last one.
Okay, this better be good.
I'm sorry, I'm actually not an architecture student. I'm a civil engineering student. And I'm very interested in your speech. You did a very excellent job, although you looked nervous at times. I'm really, really interested in your speech. So I have a question about the application of your designs.
The what? The what?
Application.
Application, okay.
Application, sorry. And how do you think, because you have many curved designs, and I wonder how it can be applied to actual designs that can be built, and how do you balance the curves and the actual usage of the space?
Yeah.
So how you deal with the somber question.
Yeah, okay. About a year and a half ago, I saw Imola. Do you guys remember Imola at UN Studio? She said aerodynamic. Aerodynamics is, but anyway, sorry.
Jim, maybe I'll try. Having known you, I think, about 15 years, maybe more, and thank you for reminding me of the journey. But without revealing all the past, I remember your very first sketches as an undergraduate, because I remember you through both programs, and also those first scribbles of the first chapter of the graphic novel, which I think was an independent study, wasn't it, after Taliesin that we did? But the real question is, what's the release date for Bureau Spectacular? The release date for Bureau Spectacular, the movie, which is really what you've been trying to make for the last 15 years. Thanks for the work.
Yeah, thanks. First, we have to cast people. Luckily, I live in LA now, and I think it's more of a sitcom than a movie. No, it's true. We've known each other for a very long time, and thanks for that. And you're right. There's a high sense of desire for entertainment in the work. And earlier today at Ante's thesis group, I was saying something about if you set the stage, players will play the part, right? And I think, yeah, if architecture becomes a room of joy, maybe the curves also has that function too, joy.